I'll be the first to admit that I have a beautiful life. I have the face of an angel and a body built for love. At least that's what more than one man has told me. For me, it meant I never wanted male attention, and I had fun playing the field until I was 24. Then, after a serious talk with my parents, I decided to settle down and think seriously about doing my civic duty by giving them some grandkids. Being the only child of rich parents, I'd never really needed a serious qualification or a serious job. Dad tried to encourage me into a field of study that would allow me to take over his business when he retired, but it just didn't interest me. I don't know if that is what subliminally first attracted me to Dave, but he was perfect. A superior physical specimen, sharp as a whip, already finished a business degree and an MBA. I think Mom and Dad fell in love with him before I did. We were married within a year, and less than a month later, I was pregnant. Fast forward 10 years, and I was the best-looking soccer mom at the private school my 2 children attended. I picked them up in a top-of-the-range BMW and then took them to our 12-bedroom McMansion in the leafiest suburb of our town. Dave, or the 15-year-old high school girl who lived next door, looked after them 2 or 3 nights a week when I went off to my job as chairperson or board member of this or that church or charity organization. On the weekends, I normally went shopping with some friends on Saturday, while Mom looked after the kids and Dave played 18 holes with Dad. On Sunday mornings, Dave and I took the kids to church. I'm not particularly a believer, but at our social level, it's kind of expected, you know? We sat in the pew that Granddad had sponsored after he made his first fortune. Later, we'd go have Sunday lunch at my parents' house, catered, of course, where lately, Dad and Dave talked about the process of Dad retiring and my husband taking over. After lunch, it was quite common for us to leave the kids with my parents, leaving Dave and me free to go home and do what married people do. Well, some of what married people do. Early on in our love life, I'd decided that I'd be conservative in the bedroom. I was pretty satisfied with my husband. Well, until recently. Yes, I snared the perfect man. A fantastic father, a terrific provider, and a considerate lover. I had money, comforts, status, respect, and just about anything else I desired. Almost. You no doubt picked up on the recent trouble I have achieving fulfillment. That all started with an erroneous keystroke when I was internet browsing one day. One wrong key, 60 minutes of browsing, 2 fingers, and my husband's days of satisfying me were numbered. You see, I accidentally stumbled onto an adult site and revealed a seductive side of myself that I never knew I had. Soon, I was rushing home from dropping the kids at school and logging onto a growing list of websites to fulfill my needs. The whole pain thing didn't yank my crank, but the idea of being restrained, of being bound and blindfolded, helpless while a powerful man did just whatever he liked to me, made me gush. The first weekend after I discovered my submissive side, I begged off to go shopping with my friends, then pretended I was sick to stay home from church. After Sunday lunch, I tried to get out of intimacy with Dave but failed. I did try eventually by extending my hands above my head, grabbing the bed head and pretending I was tied like that. Subsequent Sundays, even these fantasies failed to give me the satisfaction I desired. The obvious solution to my ever-increasing cravings was to confess my new fantasy to my husband. I'm positive he would have done whatever was necessary to keep me satisfied, but of course nice girls don't do that sort of thing. Instead, I became a faker. I felt like a tightly coiled spring. My downfall began with my discovery of an adult forum. It had a section where people could meet and then tell the rest of the readers how good their last scene was. And they were. Bound. Blindfolded. Their words were as exciting as the images that accompanied them. I won't bore you with the details, but I met a guy online who was an experienced dominant and who lived a couple of hours away. The pictures showed a guy who was perhaps mid-40s, but who still looked to be in pretty good shape. He told me he was married and his wife wasn't into the scene. He shared with me full naked photos of himself, but I only sent him body shots. I was very careful and cleaned all records off our computer, deleted browsing history, and the work. Some of my favorite stuff I kept on a memory stick that I hid in the lining of a rarely used handbag. I don't think I ever consciously made the decision to cheat on my husband. I certainly never had that internal debate with myself. I just never took any steps to stop things when the guy, Darren was his name, ordered me to arrange some time off to meet him. Nor did my conscience bother me particularly. I felt compelled to scratch a fantasy urge that was no threat to my marriage. No threat because Dave could never know, nor could anyone else I knew. Nice girls didn't do anything remotely like what I was planning. I started a list of all the things I would need to cover. Darren must have interpreted my temporary silence as reticence. He bombarded me with tales of what he intended to do to me when we did meet. Some of them really weren't my taste, but we negotiated. I know being tied down by a total stranger was a huge risk, but I was driven, as I said. I intimated that our meetings could become a regular thing, which meant if he didn't toe the line at the first one, there wouldn't be a repeat. In reality, I knew that the chances of discovery grew exponentially the longer an affair went on, and had vowed to limit the experience. You see, I'd done my research. Negotiations complete, I continued my research on not getting discovered. I know the word out there is that cheaters always get caught, but that's just propaganda and statistics. Stories and statistics of people getting away with affairs never get published. I imagine that for every affair discovered, 10 go silent. So, for the next 3 weeks, my life fell into a pattern. Drop kids at school, race home, watch the images and videos of the type of things I'd negotiated with Darren, then read cheating wife stories until it was time to pick the kids up again. My friends inevitably became bored with being rejected when they called to ask me to meet, but I didn't notice at the time. It was early on in this pattern that I discovered that one of the big giveaways to cheating wives being discovered was by behavioral changes. A little honest self-analysis revealed I was giving all the signals to anyone watching. I dragged myself back to a normal pattern when anyone else was watching, especially remembering to propose love with my husband, while all the time compiling a list of precautions. I'd meet Darren at a place at the other end of my city, somewhere I would never be recognized. My husband traveled for work at least 4 nights a fortnight. He was the business development manager of Dad's company, after all. It couldn't be too hard to prove he was where he said he was. I'd ask him to take a picture of his room when I rang him that night, saying I missed him and wanted to imagine myself where he was. I'd only leave the house after about 10 p.m. That way no one would ring or visit me and discover I wasn't there. I intended to leave my cell phone and car at home just in case someone had trackers on them. I'd meet Darren in a low-budget motel, somewhere my acquaintances were very unlikely to spot me. That made me smile. I knew at least 3 of my friends had successfully hidden affairs in the past. Wouldn't it be ironic if I was discovered by a friend meeting her beau at the same motel? I added a wig and other disguise elements to the list. I'd keep them in my locker at the tennis club so they were only here to be discovered for a minimal amount of time. I would pay cash for the room and book it either in person a few days before or from a phone at one of the charities I volunteered for. I would travel to the motel by a cab that picked me up at a local park I would walk to. That way no strange cars would be seen in the driveway, and I wouldn't be seen leaving at an unusual hour. Thanks to mobile phones, phone booths were a thing of the past in our town, so the one weak spot in my plans was that I would have to ring the cab on my cell. The best I could do was to then immediately erase all records of the call. It was highly unlikely that Dave would pull my phone records to check each individual number. So my husband and acquaintances accounted for, the only problem remaining was that of what to do with my children. Our regular babysitter needed to be home by 10 p.m., and even so, couldn't be relied on not to inadvertently mention sitting while Dave was away to my husband. I wasn't about to use a stranger for looking after them, and the youngest was too young for sleepovers. That left one possible, if far from attractive, option. I could my children and limit the time away. Say leave at 10:15 p.m., an hour cab ride, 5 hours with Darren, another hour cab ride, and I could be home by 5:15 a.m., which was still an hour before dawn at this time of year. The wig and a coat I hardly ever wore should protect me from recognition by pre-dawn dog walkers and insomniacs. As unpalatable as sedating my children was, I was driven. The closer my preparations took me to fulfilling my new fantasies, the more problems were bulldozed. In fact, it took huge efforts of willpower to critically analyze my own plans. I experimented with different over-the-counter sleeping pills, all listed as safe for young children, and found doses that forced me to wake them when it was time to get up for school. I did it every night for a week to ensure a 100% strike rate. I only stopped when Dave commented on their changed habits. It was during one of my internal security review sessions that I worried about what would happen if Darren turned out to be a serial killer, or even if he got carried away and marked me by going beyond our agreed boundaries. I noticed his email address was an initial and surname, and after half an hour on Google, I had an address. I subtly let him know that I would be leaving clues to his identity before we met, in case I disappeared. He assured me I would be safe. I also recognized a weakness of his being discovered cheating on his wife, leading her to me and my husband, so I insisted he takes the same precautions as I was. I had trouble believing his wife knew and condoned his meeting with other women. He provided the STD test I asked for, as I like my love unprotected, and there was no risk of an unwanted pregnancy because of the contraceptive pill I take religiously at 8:30 every morning. So, tonight is the night. It's 10:10 p.m. I finished dressing in a slinky black dress that Dave bought me a couple of years ago, and my overnight bag with toiletries and a few odds and sods, as my grandma used to say, is packed. Caller ID showed that Dave rang from a number with an area code consistent with where he was supposed to be, a 3-hour flight away. The cab was on its way and the kids were safely and soundly asleep in their beds. I'd ended up paying cash for 3 nights of room hire, in a false name, of course. The extra nights were Darren's idea, and a valid one if you ask me. By the time I got there and then had to leave to be home before dawn, we'd barely have 5 quality hours. What if I loved it and wanted more? Dave was away until his flight landed at lunchtime on Thursday. I could repeat what I was doing tomorrow and Wednesday night, after all. The money for the room meant nothing to someone as well off as me. 3 nights to get it out of my system. 3 nights to prevent it becoming a long-term thing, where the chances of being discovered rose exponentially. Yes, it was a sensible move. I logged into our computer to check for any last-minute emails from Darren. There were none. I checked the deleted items folder, which was clear of evidence, and then sent a quick note to my soon-to-be master saying I was on my way. A glance at my watch showed that it was time to walk to the park to meet the cab. After one final look in the mirror, I wondered if I should back out even now. But the excitement said no. What could possibly go wrong? I put my phone on the kitchen counter and headed out. I was very excited in anticipation by the time the taxi deposited me at the motel. No one was around, which was a relief. Tapping gently on the door of room 310, I smiled at Darren's forethought. The Do Not Disturb sign was already hanging on the doorknob. There was only a shaded bedside light on when Darren opened the door. My first impression was one of disappointment. His profile picture on the website must have been quite dated, as in reality, he was perhaps 10 years older than I'd thought and carrying a fair bit more weight. I later noticed his fingers were stained by nicotine, and when he kissed me, it was with the unmistakable reek of liquor mixed with stale cigarettes on his breath. That's as far as I got before, after a single hello and a nuzzle of my lips, he jumped on me. I heard the dress rip in his haste to remove it. I loved it. I just hoped he remembered his promise not to mark me, however. By the sound of his breathing, there wasn't a lot of control happening. He was as excited as me. As I basked in the sensations, already getting re-excited by my feeling of helplessness, I thought how I'd done the right thing. I could have 3 nights of risk-free ecstasy, and no one would ever be the wiser. Stopping my new hobby anytime in the near future might be a problem, though, but I'm sure the risks from that could be mitigated with a little more research. Tuesday, 9:45 a.m. Jan, It's Dave. The kids just rang me to say that when they awoke this morning, Sue wasn't there. They've searched the house and can't find her. Dave paused at this point to catch his breath, shortened by the adrenaline coursing through his system. His mother-in-law was worried by the tone of his voice. "Well, she's not here," she answered. "Can you get over there as soon as possible?" Dave questioned. "Sure, I'll ring you when I get there," she answered. Tuesday, 6:53 p.m. to Thursday, 8 p.m. Dave, having flown home as quickly as he could, had just finished hugging his children tightly. They were putting a brave face on it, but he could see in their eyes they were very worried. He turned to his in-laws and thanked them for being there for his family. "Have you tried the police again, Pete?" Dave questioned. "Yes, same answer. Unless there is evidence to the contrary, they assume a person just walked out for the first 48 hours. The place was as neat as a pin. With no sign, Sue hadn't just walked out the door." Dave interrupted. "Except her car is still in the garage and her phone was on the table near the back door, not on the charger where she normally keeps it." Sue's mother, Jan, noticed that the conversation was distressing the children, so she hustled them into the kitchen to finish preparing dinner. Dave and Pete adjourned to the study. Dave's father-in-law lowered his voice to a more conspiratorial level. "Her phone was here, but her house keys and handbag weren't. It's like she just walked out to go to the corner shop and never came back. Except that the nearest corner shop is an hour's walk away and my Sue would never leave the kids like that," Dave answered. "There's one more strange thing, Dave. I found these on the kitchen counter." The older man showed him a bottle of over-the-counter children's sedatives and a tiny measuring cup. The obvious reason why those items were there didn't register to a man who loved his wife fiercely and respected her commitment as a mother above all her other prodigious attributes. The possibility that she'd deliberately made them sleep was just so far from his image of his wife that he ignored them and went back to worrying. His children had last seen their mother when she put them to bed at 9:30 p.m. the night before. Where was she? His own phone call to the police confirmed what his in-laws had said. With no disturbance in the house and his wife's handbag and house keys gone, they assumed she'd just walked out and didn't want to be found. It happened. Dave then called everyone in their address book. No one had seen Sue. He and his in-laws concentrated on distracting the children. Nevertheless, sleep was hard to come by for everyone in the household that night. In the morning, Dave staggered bleary-eyed to the kitchen where Pete was already halfway through a coffee. They exchanged pleasantries, until the older man spoke his mind. Dave, have you checked her email account yet? You do have access, right?" "Good thinking, Dad. Unless she's changed her password, I'll be able to access her account." They went to the study and fired up the family desktop. Sue's password worked, and soon the pair were snooping. The inbox looked normal, and sorting the emails by sender and a quick trip down the list showed no unfamiliar names. Pete, who was more comfortable around computers than his son-in-law, next suggested they check the deleted items folder. It was empty. The older man's heart sank a little more. He suggested Dave check the sent items folder, fully expecting that to be empty as well. It almost was. Almost, except for a solitary email sent to Hardman at just after 10 on Monday night. The simple message was chilling. "Be there shortly." Either Sue hadn't bothered deleting it, or it had been transmitted after she deleted the sent items folder. Dave turned his head away, which brought the bottle of junior sedative from the previous night into view. A link clicked in Dave's head just as Peter followed his gaze and quickly came to the same conclusion. "Surely she wouldn't have, Dad?" Dave questioned. "Got a better theory?" Pete answered. Anger at his wife fought for dominance with fear. It was starting to look like Sue had slated her own children to meet someone on Monday night, and for some reason hadn't come back. Armed with that circumstantial evidence of foul play, Dave rang the police again. They still refused to get involved, but did suggest he take the children for blood tests, which he did. He dropped them off at school late, and then went home. Once there, he sent an email to Hardman. "Just tell Sue to come home. Her children are worried." If you've harmed her, I will find you and destroy you. Wednesday night passed as slowly as the previous one. The pathology lab rang early on Thursday morning to say that quite high levels of chemicals present in the sedatives were present in the children's blood samples. With possible evidence of a crime, the police finally took the case seriously and asked for the email address found on the computer, but warned them not to get their hopes up, as identifying people from an email address was iffy at best. With nothing else to do, all three adults then sat near their phones waiting for news. Thursday, 8:01 p.m. I stood outside my own front door, disheveled, exhausted, and terrified. I clutched my torn, slinky black dress, the same one I'd put on Monday night, to prevent it from gaping and exposing my left unfettered chest. I breathed in and out slowly, trying to calm myself, trying to forget the nightmare that had been the last 3 days, trying not to think of the immeasurable storm that was going to be the next few hours. But the nightmare... I've been unable to escape the memories of my nightmare. I remembered back to what seemed like years ago, to that feeling as my first excitement abated, with a sweating Darren above me. He must have seen the look of excitement in my eyes, and I guess as a sadist, he didn't like that. He reached past my left ear and pulled something from under the pillow. It was a black leather device, looking like a cat o' nine tail from the old days. It had multiple leather tassels, each with a knot at the end. He continued thrusting away into me all the time, looking in my eyes as he raised the device. I guess my expression had already changed before the first stinging blow fell across my chest. It hurt. My eyes must have shown him that, as did my muffled scream. The look on his face was sickening as he laid in with the device. I looked down and saw the angry wheals on my chest. His repeated promises not to mark me had lasted less than 5 minutes. It was only then I realized what a totally helpless situation I'd put myself in. My mind was in terror about what Darren might do next and what shape he'd leave my body in. Strange noises brought me back from wherever my terror-filled mind had gone. Opening my eyes, the first thing I saw was that the look of excitement was gone from Darren's face. It was replaced by a look of agony. He was gasping and clutching his chest as his face turned a sickly white color. As I watched, he suddenly collapsed on me and twitched for perhaps half a minute before I heard a sound I'd only read about in books. Suddenly, unpowered lungs had the air expelled from them as gravity did its work. Unmistakable, even to someone who'd never heard it before, and terrifying. Darren was gone. The full weight of him was pressed on my chest, and it felt like every time I exhaled, I didn't have the power to inflate my lungs again. I thrashed around in panic, but as my arms and legs were at full stretch, I couldn't get any leverage to push him off. Finally, I think it was my sweat that lubricated our body contact, and Darren's body slid into a position that was more on my stomach than my chest. His head was in my left armpit, and when I looked down, I could see his sightless eyes still open and staring at me. Something foul was seeping from his mouth, as his stomach was slightly higher than his head. That odor battled with my own vomit. As horrible as this experience was, it was pushed to insignificance by my terror. It was perhaps 11:30 p.m. and I was stuck here, unable to call for help because I couldn't communicate beyond a grunt or reach a wall to tap on it with any body part. I was stuck here until a maid came around to check if the room needed anything. When? 9, 10 in the morning? By that time, my kids would have woken from their sleep, gone into Mummy's room to wake her, and found her gone. I could imagine their terror when they found the house empty, and it made me panic and thrash around some more. I got myself under control, though, when I thought that I might move Darren's body again to a position that was crushing my lungs. I stopped moving and cried instead. What would my children do when they discover themselves alone? Go next door to the neighbors? Or use the sheet of speed dial numbers next to the house phone and call who? Dave or my parents? Neither one was good. Dave would be terrified and confused and would immediately call my cell, which would ring from the table near the door at home. Then he'd ring my parents and Mum would go to the house as quickly as she could. Dad would be at work. She'd discover me gone, perhaps my phone but missing purse, and then what? Ring Dave? Ring the police? Either way, I was toast. Unless, and here my mind was clutching at straws, the maid came in really early and I convinced her to find the handcuff keys and let me go, then promised her enough money that she wouldn't call the police immediately. I could get my hands on maybe 10 grand quickly and untraceable. I could rush home as quickly as possible, hopefully, wake my kids, apologize for sleeping in, and take them to school. Then call the police. I could threaten them with legal action if they told the media and have it all settled by the time school was out, or get Mum to pick them up. It was no big deal. 2 consenting adults participating in a legal activity. One that just happened to go very badly wrong. That was all good. Things would work out fine. Then I remembered that I'd booked the room for 3 days. But that was fine. The maid service still checked each room daily for fresh towels, etc. Then I remembered the do not disturb sign on the outside knob, and all my delusions collapsed. I heard myself let out a noise past the gag that was a sigh. The death rattle of my marriage and perfect life, terminally soiled by my and Darren's bile, and from the signals my bladder was saying, soon to be urine as well. I guess I spent the next hour in an increasingly desperate attempt to remove the gag, but the only thing I had to rub it against was Darren's cheek, and it just wasn't solid enough. It got a little more promising when the stiffness of death set in, and I nearly managed to remove the gag. What amazed me was that Darren's whiskers seemed to actually continue to grow after he was dead. Closing my eyes protected me from seeing the fearful rictus his face was becoming, but nothing could protect me from the increasingly foul stench pervading the room. Death doesn't smell pretty. Soon, the rigor passed and Darren softened again, by which time I had nothing left in my stomach to evacuate. Daylight spilled through the tightly closed curtains, raising the temperature of the room slightly. Well, enough that my shivering abated slightly. Darren's cooled body was sapping the heat from mine badly. Far worse than the danger of hypothermia and the humiliation of lying in my own urine was the problem of thirst. How long can a person go without water? I seem to remember it was as low as 2 to 3 days. I might have known if I'd paid more attention in school, rather than spent all my efforts on making sure my clothes were better than the other girls, and making sure they were revealing enough to grab the bulk of the male attention in the class. Then I got to thinking that death might be preferable to what was possibly coming my way. My legacy and memory might well be annihilated, but at least I wouldn't be around to see it. The brightness of the curtains indicated the sun had set far enough to penetrate the narrow gap between rows of rooms in the cheap motel, reinforcing that rescue wasn't coming that day. Already my tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth, and I hadn't urinated since around the middle of the day. Small blessings. I hoped I could speak fast enough to stop the maid from calling the police when she found me in the morning. With no police involved, all sorts of explanations were credible. As the night wore on, though, even I recognized some of them as fanciful delusions brought on by utter desperation and thirst. I think my last conscious thought before a crippling headache and delirium consumed me was a simple one. I'm screwed. Hero mother to zero with one stupid decision. I never met the maid who found me, although I dearly would like to one day, when I'm armed with something deadly. My first memory was of being jolted on a gurney as they put me in the ambulance. I was attached to one of those devices that drips stuff into you. The ambos had obviously recognized my extreme dehydration and started me on fluids. They'd also stuffed my handbag beside me. My next memory was of being wheeled into the hospital and someone trying to take my bag away. I clung to it like grim death. I would contact my family when I was ready, and had half a chance of defending a credible story. Until then, I was going to remain anonymous. With heat packs and the IV, then small sips of water, I physically recovered enough by the afternoon to start thinking lucidly again. Planning was interrupted when the police interviewed me. I stuck to the truth and reminded them about their duty of discretion, threatening them with legal action personally if the media found out about my story. The sergeant gave me a look as he left, which seemed to be a confusing mix of amusement and pity. I had a credible story by mid-afternoon, but I won't bore you with it. Much of it hinged on my family being so relieved by my sudden reappearance that they wouldn't ask too many searching questions. The staff doctor finally released me during his evening rounds just before 7 p.m., and I quickly donned my torn dress. I asked the nurse on the way out if there were any clothes shops nearby open at this time of night and received an abrupt and rather cold no. She did deign to call me a cab, though, and I sat in the hospital entrance waiting for it, quietly confident, despite my apparel. There was a television in the reception area, tuned to the 7 o'clock news, and it ended my confidence and my life. The top story was all about little old me. There were photos of me lying on the motel bed under a dead Darren, obviously taken by the maid and sold to the media. My face was blacked out, I suppose, for legal reasons. It was a scene under the control of the coroner, after all. No such courtesy was afforded by the television cameras, though. How they'd beaten the ambulance leaving, I'll never know, but they had. My face was clearly recognizable as the gurney was trundled up to the ambulance. They even showed one of the handcuffs still attached to my wrists. I collapsed mentally and must have been almost carried to the taxi when it arrived. Who gave the driver my address is a mystery, but the next memory I have is of standing right here, right now, facing the door out to the execution yard, devoid of hope or even the will to fight. Monday, 11 a.m. Any delusions I may have harbored lasted about 300 milliseconds after my husband opened the door. Over his shoulder, I could see the television, and it was tuned to the station I'd so recently seen myself on. He looked deep into my eyes with an eyebrow raised in question. This was it. My moment of truth. My opportunity to say I was kidnapped, handcuffed to a bed, and abused for 3 days. That I was worthy of his pity, not his contempt. Then I looked at my phone, still on the table next to the door, the handbag in my hand, then down at what I was wearing. Any fight left in me drained away with that last glance. I sank to my knees in shame and defeat. Dave didn't have to say a word. As if that wasn't enough, I heard a high-pitched voice ask from somewhere behind him. "Really, Sue? Doing this to your own children?" It was my own mother's voice. If my mother was sure enough to condemn me, I knew I would be well and truly written off in my father's eyes. He loved Dave, as the son he never had, almost as much as he did me. I don't know how long it was after the door slammed in my face that I heard a voice behind me asking me to confirm my name. It was the police. I was arrested, cuffed, taken to the station, and charged. When presented with the evidence of my fingerprints on the bottle of sedatives, my absence from the family home, and blood tests from the children, I saw no point in denying anything. The media went into a frenzy, of course, a high-profile mother doing this to her children so she could attend a tryst with her lover, and not just any sort of lover, her dominant, and then said, while she's tied to the bed and is trapped for 3 days. That angle just added fuel to the flame. I challenge you to write a more emotive story. After 4 nights in jail, when it became obvious that no one was going to post bail, the state released me on my own recognizance. Someone must have tipped off the media as they were all waiting for me outside the jail, and it was the longest walk of my life until they finally gave up on me. I reviewed my options when my feet took me to the main street of town. Did I say hero to zero before? I meant a hero to negative several million. My shallow society friends would never have anything to do with me ever again, or risk being smeared with my poison. My children were old enough to understand I'd risked and betrayed them in just about the worst way a mother can. Besides, they had a doting dad and 2 close grandparents. They didn't need me. If I stuck around, I'd be laughed at and spat at until the memory of my behavior faded, then just shunned until I died. I looked in my purse to see how much cash I had. Less than $200. I spied a cash machine across the street and decided to see if any of my cards still worked. It was a 50-50 chance in my judgment. But we all know how bad my judgment of late had proven to be. If any of my cards worked, I would turn left toward the bus station. If they didn't, I would turn right, toward the bridge over the long drop to the river. I pushed the first card in and held my breath. And so, we've reached the end of today's story. Was it what you expected, or did it take a twist you didn't see coming? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's get a conversation going. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button. And if you're new here or just haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join our community. I bring you fresh, captivating stories every day, so click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.